Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nurit Viesel-Nordmeyer. I'm from the TU Dortmund University, Germany, and it's a great pleasure for me today to welcome you to our symposium focusing the relationship between working memory, respectively related cognitive skills, and mathematical learning. I truly appreciate the opportunity for a mutual discussion of this important topic and would therefore really like to thank the MCLS committee for having us today. Moment. If you take a look at the schedule of our symposium, you will see that unfortunately on the way to this virtual format of the conference, we have lost one of our talks, which was announced for the beginning. And now in the following, I have to start the symposium myself with the first talk. Subsequently, Cubillo from University of Zurich will give us interesting insights into the neural and behavioral impacts of working memory training in typically developing school-age children. And Joerg-Tobias Kuhn from TU Dortmund University will conclude our symposium by shedding light on the role of basic numerical skills as risk factor for comorbidity between ADHD and math disability. So I think, like the other symposia before, we will give the chance for some short question in between the individual talks, and of course for a general discussion after the last talk. And now I like to start by talking with you about the influence of previous mathematical and linguistic skills on the performance of working memory for mathematical learning processes. Research will show that previous knowledge is a very strong predictor for further knowledge building. And this is independently if we are focusing on mathematical skills or linguistic skills. And in addition, there are some findings which support that different working memories have a very strong influence on further knowledge building in addition. But let us go back to the special role of the previous knowledge for further knowledge building. And we can assume that there is, in addition to the direct influence and indirect influence over the release of the working memory capacity, and therefore supports the further knowledge building. So some studies point to this assumption. First, let me show one from linguistic skills from Gettercole and colleagues, which examining the vocabulary development and the role of the phonological loop of working memory for this development pattern. And they found in preschool age that with 4 years, there is a strong influence from phonological loop on vocabulary skills. But 1 year later, there seems to be a reversing effect, and the existing vocabulary skills are a strong predictor of the performance of the phonological loop. For mathematics, we can focus on results from children in primary school age who is examining in parallel mathematical skills and a comprehensive cognitive basic skills measurements with working memory measurements indirect included. And she found, spanning grade 1 up to grade 4, a mutual relationship pattern over time between both components, so mathematics and indirect working memory measurements. And the same relationship pattern could be confirmed by, based on the ICLS data by Miller-Cotto and Byrnes, which compared different relationship patterns between mathematical skills and the digits bent backward of working memory. And they found the best model fit for this mutual relationship pattern spanning end of K up to grade 2, and the same for more advanced linguistic skills, so reading and also the digits bent backward. But it seems to be more complex, especially for this proposed relationship pattern between working memory and mathematics and the mathematical knowledge building, because studies or results of studies also emphasize that linguistics skills play a very special role for mathematical learning, which can be divided in different functions, like the acquisition of mathematical skills or conveying mathematical skills, and as last storage processes within mathematical learning. And with this information, we can draw this relationship pattern between working memory, linguistics, and mathematics, which is very important by research interest on the mathematical learning process, so in our studies. And I like to add one more. So from results of cross-sectional studies which found in preschool age, there was no direct relationship of the phonological loop of working memory, but an indirect relationship mediated over linguistic parameters. But there is a lack of knowledge which explains the aforementioned special role of linguistic skills for mathematical learning when we are focusing in parallel at the proposed relationships of mathematics and working memory, and second, for the proposed relationship between linguistics and working memory, for the linguistic knowledge building, for the aforementioned influence of linguistic skills on mathematical learning, and at last, both proposed relationship pattern with working memory, first in the linguistic knowledge building and second in the mathematical knowledge building. And what does this mean for the specific role of linguistic skills and over the different functions I mentioned before? So we write out two research questions. By focusing on all three components in parallel, mathematics, working memory, and linguistics, for a better understanding of the mathematical learning process. First, we are interested to the relationships between mathematical skills, respectively linguistic skills, and the capacity of working memory show mutual influence in pre and primary school age. And I like to emphasize especially our interest on different working memory components, because the aforementioned studies only focus on one specific working memory component if we have the hierarchical model of Bedele in mind. And so we are interested on different working memory components and if there are some differences in the relationship patterns. And we also assume the mutual relationship pattern for mathematical knowledge building and linguistic knowledge building when we are looking in parallel on all three components. And the second research question is, which role do the analyzed relationships between mathematical skills and working memory on the one side and linguistic skills and working memory on the other side play for the aforementioned very specific role of linguistic skills for mathematical learning? And therefore we suggest a mediated effect over linguistic parameters, like the results of the cross-sectional studies found for the phonological loop. So we try to answer this research question by use available data of two longitudinal data sets. First, from the German National Educational Panel Studies, the starting cohort 2, which is spanning age pre and primary school age, so our age span of infant. And this is a representative sample up to over 6,000 children. But due to our research interest and the study design with a strong enrollment by with a strong data refreshment by enrollment in primary school, we have to use the longitudinal section, so about 430 children in the sample. This means, especially by looking in parallel at all three components spanning age 4 up to 8 and 4 measurement time points. And in addition, we use data of a smaller but more elaborated data set with 5 measurement time points spanning age 4 to 6, so semi-annual measurements, but especially more differentiated measurements in linguistics and especially more differentiated direct measurements for working memory. And of course, due to the running time, I can't go in depth in the different instruments now, but I like to emphasize that these are international compatible instruments, and Now I like to go to the distribution of the different studies. First, you can see for study 1, the national panel study, the German one is, you can see not all variables of interest were measured all points in time. So for example, we were not able to compute a cross-latch panel analysis. And especially I like to stress that working memory, there was only a direct measurement in preschool age, which was included in the phonological information processing test. And due to our interest on indirect measurement, we also used information, indirect information, depending on recent research from cognitive basic skill tests. So we have some information indirect for working memory in primary school and another one in preschool to the direct one. And let me show you the distribution for study 2. For the smaller study, you can see more linguistic measurements and the direct working memory measurements, which are more differentiated, were also placed in preschool age. And by matching both data sets, we were able to cover a more comprehensive age span, so especially in our age span of interest, and both the results of both studies could strengthen each other, so we were able for a more adequate answering of our research question with more robust results. And we used longitudinal and cross-sectional test analysis and mediation analysis and control for a lot of variables which could influence linguistic skills, mathematical skills, and also the performance of working memory. And now let me show you the results. First, we found a lot of direct effects from linguistic skills, the differentiated linguistic skills on mathematical learning, and even from preschool linguistic skills on later mathematical learning in primary school age, and some indirect effects which mediated from one linguistic measurement over the other on mathematical performances. And let us now switch to the result for our research question. First, for the linguistic knowledge building and the relationship between linguistic skills and working memory. And when we look at our results, we can see that our results indicate a reversing effect for grammar skills, receptive and expressive measurements over the direct measurements of working memory. And I like to emphasize that this is only for both phonological loop and central executive in study 1, though this is a panel study, the German panel study, and in study 2, the smaller study only over the phonological loop, but there are also some indirect effects over the phonological loop, which also match reversing effects for study 2 over the central executive. And what is really important here is we can't find reversing or mutual effects between vocabulary skills and working memory, like in the study of Gathercon and colleagues were found. Now let us switch to the research question 1 for mathematical knowledge building. And you can see we also found some reversing effects and of course a lot of single effects. And let me point out that the reversing effects between mathematics and working memory is in study 1, the German panel study, over the central executive direct and indirect measurements, and for the smaller study again over the phonological loop. And let us now switch to the results for research question 1, where we're asking for the specific role of linguistic skills for this relationship pattern between mathematics and working memory. And let us go back to our mentioned relationship pattern between mathematics and working memory. And when we now look in depth in the results of the mediation analysis, we found in majority at the same places where we find the direct effects, indirect effects, which are in majority mediated over linguistic parameters. These are the violet arrows. And at last, we will look for the influence of the proposed relationship between linguistics and working memory in the linguistic knowledge building for mathematical learning, and our results indicate a mediated effect from grammar skills, receptive and expressive measurement over working memory, direct measurement, phonological loop, and central executive on further mathematical knowledge. And I like to emphasize again that this mediated effect is only for both phonological loop and central executive in the German panel study, and in study 2 only over the phonological loop. And let us stay in the results of study 2. There is in addition an only indirect effect in mediation from vocabulary skills, expressive measurement over working memory of the phonological loop on mathematical performance. To sum it up, our results help for better understanding of the complex relationship between all three components, linguistics, mathematics, and different working memory components, which is very interesting for a better understanding of the mathematical learning process. First, by a confirmation of the proposed dual importance of previous skills for further knowledge building, which was drawn on the one side by the relationship between linguistic skills and working memory, and on the other side between mathematical skills and working memory. And second, our results indicate the importance of linguistic skills in different functions. First, as requirement for mathematical learning, and second, in the aforementioned mathematical knowledge building and the relationship between mathematical skills and working memory. On the one hand, like in the results of the cross-sectional study was found for phonological loop, but we found this also for central executive and also longitudinal, and also when at the same time point is a direct effect as a mediator of effects of working memory on mathematical knowledge. And on the other hand, as requirement, as prerequisite for the performance of working memory, and therefore support the mathematical knowledge building. So I like to conclude by going in depth in the differences between the studies with 2 points. First, the specific importance of different working memory components for mathematical learning, which matched perfect to the results of an unpublished study, which found very different influences of different working memory components on differentiated mathematical skills. So let us imagine in our study, in study 1, the panel studies the central executive, and in study 2, the phonological loop. And the second point is the relief of working memory capacities for different linguistic skills. So for this explanation, let me show you the instrument table again. The last point is easy to explain. If you look here on the left side, you can see there's only an expressive test in study 2. But for the first mentioned point for mathematical skills and the importance of different working memory components, I think we should go in depth in the different used mathematical constructs. Let us first show in study 1, and there is a more comprehensive mathematical construct like in PISA. This includes arithmetic skills, geometry, word problems, or quantity number competences. Though this could explain the request on more complex working memory processes like central executive. And in study 2, where the focus was on younger children, there was a more basic construct with focus on counting abilities like counting number sequence or quantity number competences, though this could explain the relationship with phonological loop, perhaps, for example, when we are thinking about the digit test. And let me now go back to our 2 points which explain or which show the differences between the both studies. And keeping this both points in mind, let us look or draw our attention at the different components which are included in our analysis. And when we're now thinking again, for example, on the digit test, and we are thinking for the request on this different component, And I think we should ask, is there really clear contrasting? And I like to finish the talk by posing the question on ourselves, are we truly measuring really different constructs? So with this, I want to go short or quick to the limitation. First, as I mentioned, we can't compute across large panel analysis due to the variables which was not measured at all points in time in study 1 and the small sample size in study 2. It was not possible to compute an overall model, and so we should pay attention for overestimation of effect size, but I think we have results of both studies which strengthen each other could help for this problem. And let us stay by 2 limitation points which are very necessary for new research, which should be done in the future for a better understanding of the mathematical learning process by looking at all 3 components, longitudinal, and we should focus on repeated and direct measurements of all working memory components. So at best, different tests like non-verbal and verbal, and especially, and on this, our differences in the 2 studies point to a separate mapping of differentiated mathematical skills. So thank you for your attention. So if there are now some short questions, I look in the chat. No, then there are some questions. Or should we go on with the next talk from Anna Cubillo? Okay, I think Anna, you can share your slide.
Great. So thank you. Thanks, Nurit, for inviting me to be part of this symposium. It's a great opportunity. Let me see. How can I think I will first share my screen and then open my presentation. Share the screen. Should be this one. And then you should be seeing my presentation now, right? I cannot see any of you, so I assume that's the case.
Yep.
Yes.
Good, thank you. Sorry, it's gone. Right, so as I said, thanks again, Nurit, for having me here today. And as you can see, the title from my presentation is slightly different. It's the same data set though. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that we're going to be looking at a very specific measure, which is intra-individual variability in task performance, and how this is sensitive to the results of a cognitive training in primary school children, and how actually this measure is not only sensitive, but is also associated with the long-term outcomes in a follow-up assessment. So why training working memory? We know that working memory is thought to be important for self-regulation skills, and that there is a potential for transfer effects of working memory to other cognitive abilities that are at least sustained or supported by shared brain networks. And there is evidence that working memory training programs can improve not only working memory, but also other cognitive functions such as attention, delayed discounting, or impulsive behaviors. And there is an increased recruitment of key regions in the prefrontal cortex, as well as increased connectivity across different brain networks. However, the results from the different studies are still very much under debate, and it is not clear whether these cognitive trainings may be truly effective, whether if this is effective, there is any part transfer, and if there is any effect, whether these effects are actually going to be long-lasting. And it is not surprising because the different studies have used different populations, children's or adult studies. Sometimes they have used healthy participants and other times clinical population from very different groups. And sometimes definitely they have used different cognitive training regimes, and therefore the non-conclusive results are somehow not surprising. But I would like to draw your attention to a recent study that is just submitted and hopefully published very soon. And it was conducted in Germany with over 500 primary school children, and they performed a working memory training program in the school. And what they observed is that when you have an assessment straight after the cognitive training has finished, in many outcome measures, the significant effect of training is not evident. And you can see it here, for example, that even in the case of tasks that have actually been related, that are still working memory tasks, although not directly trained. The effect is not evident straight after the training. However, when you do the follow-up assessments, you can see that the effect is there, and it starts to be evident later in time. But it also happens with other cognitive tasks. So if you go for a go-no-go task that is measuring attention or inhibition, and you just take the measurement straight after the training, you will see no differences between the two groups or even after 6 months. But if you continue and follow them up after 1 year, you can see strong differences there. And the same if you look into academic performance or IQ measures. Although some measures will not show differences across any of the long-term assessments, geometry or reading or even Raven's IQ assessments, they will see very strong effects, but only in the long-term assessments. So the current aims of our study was to try and replicate the study from the German sample and in Switzerland using the same working memory training in primary school children. And what we wanted to look at is the immediate effects at the behavioral level and at the neurobiological level when the working memory training, and most importantly, to look at the potential cognitive mechanisms that may be leading to this impact in the long-term effect. And what we're going to be looking at is that actually a measure we hypothesize that intra-individual variability in task performance may be able to detect these subtle differences that may be evident already in the straight after the training, but not in some other outcome measures. But we would be able to pick this up with intra-individual variability in performance. And why are we thinking that this would be the case? Because we know that it may be able to detect both short-term training effects and potential long-term benefits, because intra-individual variability of reaction time does follow very nicely the well-established pattern of brain and cognitive development. It does decline during childhood and adolescence, and it becomes very stable in adulthood, which is indicative of cognitive function. And then when the cognitive function starts to decline again in old age, intra-individual variability of reaction time increases again. And we know it is associated to the integrity of brain structure and brain function, mostly supported by dopaminergic neuromodulation. And it is associated with better performance in cognitive processes that are supported by this region, and inhibition and control abilities, for example, and is both in healthy participants as well as in clinical population, and again, in children and adults. So this is consistent across all populations. So the details of the study are as follows. The training happened in the schools over 5 weeks during 5 days a week, and it happened about 30 to 45 minutes a day. And the classrooms were randomized either to the working memory training or to the active control groups, and both the students and the parents were blind to the treatment condition. And in the brain imaging part of the study, 28 participants took part. 16 of them belonged to the working memory training group and 12 to the control group. And when they took part in this imaging section of the study, they did three tasks inside the scanner. One was a visual Mvac task, because we wanted to see whether after the training there was any transfer to untrained working memory processes. And in this case, it's a very standard Mvac task, where in the 0 back condition, participants have to press whenever they see the sun on the screen. And in the 1, 2, or 3 back conditions, they have to press the button whenever the image they are seeing on the screen is the same as 1, as 2, or as 3 before it. And we classified the trials as low working memory trials in the 0 and 1 back conditions, because those are trials that are tapping mostly on attention functions, whereas the 2 and 3 back are having a much higher load on working memory and therefore are classified as high working memory trials. And our main performance measures are accuracy, in this case the D prime that incorporates both hits and false alarms, and as the intra-individual variability measure, we have the coefficient of variation that again includes both the standard deviation of reaction time and the mean reaction times. The second task that they did inside the scanner was a flanker task, because again we want to see whether there is any transfer to cognitive processes that are not directly targeted by the working memory training. And in this case, it's interference inhibition and selective attention. And participants are instructed to feed the fish that is in the center of the screen and ignore the flanker fishes. And this is easy when all of them are pointing towards the same direction. It's a congruent trial, but in the incongruent trials, they are facing opposite directions and therefore becomes more difficult. And again, we have performance variables that have to do with accuracy and with the intra-individual variability of the responses. And in the last task that they did inside the scanner was an intertemporal choice task. And in this case, they are presented on each trial with two options. Either they can go for a smaller amount of tokens that they can get immediately after the scanner session, or they can go for a much larger amount of tokens, but they will have to wait a number of days to get those tokens, and therefore to exchange those tokens for a present after the scanning session. In this case, there is a delay of 4 days, and in this case, they have to wait 14 days to get the tokens. And I'm not going to go into detail there, but this task, I just show you that just for you to know that they were for about over an hour inside the scanner, but I'm not going to go into the results of this. Basically, there were no differences in this task, whatever we look at. And as part of the much larger behavioral school training program, they did 4 assessments. So 1 pre and post training to assess that there were no differences at baseline and how they were doing straight after the training, and 2 follow-up assessments at 6 and 12 months. And I just will draw your attention to 2 main measures there, because we're going to be looking at the association with long-term outcomes. And for that, we want to see whether any training has an impact in real life for the participant. And in this case, we look into well-being measures. The one we use is the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, the SDQ, which is a screening measure commonly used in clinical settings. And usually the clinician assesses when the participant goes above a certain threshold on a different area, like behavioral problems or attentional problems or emotional problems, they would be referred to a specialist for a further assessment. So it's a screening measure of psychological well-being of the participant. And this is how this looks like for those of you who are not familiar with this. And then the second measure, as I was saying, we want to see whether the training has an impact in real life in the long term. And real life for children is a school. And therefore we look at the school performance measures. We look at how this may be related to differences in reading, geometry, or arithmetics. So what we find in terms of behavior and brain activation is straight after the training. Well, when they perform the Mvac task, we can see that in the high working memory, both groups are doing a little bit worse than in the easy condition in the low working memory trials. But the differences between the groups, this is the trained group and this is the control group, is only evident in the easy condition, in the easy trials. And when we look at variability of the responses, we see that the trained group is actually having a more stable response with lower intra-individual variability across all trial types. And we interpret this as the trained group being more able to be online and stay on the task and perform properly, despite the fact that the easy trials would be a bit more boring. And in the flanker task, what we see is that across both congruent and incongruent trials, the participants in the trained group are able to perform better, have a higher accuracy than the control group in both trial types. And again, as we did in the Mvac task, we see a reduced variability, intra-individual variability in the responses across all trial types relative to that of the comparison group. So we see that the stability, there is a reduced variability in the responses, a more stable response pattern across all trial types, and both in the flanker and in the Mvac task, which is a very interesting result. When we look at the brain imaging results in the Mvac task, we find that the imaging results are mirroring nicely what we have seen in the behavioral part, because it is only in the easy condition, in the easy trials, where the 2 groups are differing in terms of bold signal. And what we see is that there is increased activation in the dorsal striatum, in the putamen, as well as the anterior cingulate or the lateral prefrontal cortex, is increased activation in the trained group relative to the compared group, which again is indicative that these are regions typically referred to as being involved in selective attention and sustained attention processes. And what we did, we wanted to see whether changes in these brain regions may be related to a higher stability of the response pattern that we have seen is consistent across different tasks. And for that, we extracted the bold signal across the whole task in these regions, in mass selected from these regions, and we saw a regression analysis with the performance measure. And we see that both stability of the responses and accuracy in the D prime in the Mvac task is related to activation in the dorsal striatum. So this is strongly selected, strongly associated. And the same for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, although in this case, it doesn't reach the significance level, but you can see that there is a significant association between higher activation in these regions and a more stable response pattern across all trial types. And we wanted to look at the transfer to other cognitive tasks or to other cognitive processes. And we didn't see differences in terms of brain activation in the flanker task. So we wanted to investigate further what cognitive processes, what are the mechanisms that may be behind the changes in the behavior. And for that, we used the drift diffusion modeling, which allows to estimate a combined measure of accuracy and reaction time variability. And the way these models work is that basically they consider that the participant or the brain of the participant is considered as an evidence accumulator. So the participant will be looking at the screen and trying to accumulate enough evidence to decide which is a good response. In this case, whether the target fish is looking towards the right or to the right, this would be the evidence of accumulation rate, and the participant keeps looking to the red, to the light, until he has enough evidence, and then it reaches a threshold, and the participant gives a response. So the participant is going to have a response pattern that may differ. If he has a very steep drift rate, it may be having a very fast response, but sometimes it's not going to be that accurate. If these boundaries that he needs to reach to perform the response are very narrow, again, you're going to have a much more impulsive response style that may give you faster responses, but less accurate. And in this case, we calculate that how steep this drift rate is a combination of how the participant treats the information conveyed by the target fish, the direction of the target fish, and the information conveyed by the flanker, the distractor fishes. These are the results from the regression. This is the result for the working memory group, for the comparison group. But I would like you to focus your attention on this, because this is the comparison between the different estimation for the two groups. And you can see that is the target drift coefficient, the difference between the target and distraction, and the boundary that is significantly different between the two groups. And this means that basically the trained group is giving more relevance to the information conveyed by the target fish, to where the target fish is pointing towards, and is maximizing the difference between how they treat the information from the target and from the distractor, and how wide the boundaries is. So basically they are more able to focus their attention on the key aspect of the trial. Yeah, they focus their attention on the key aspect of the trial, and then they're being able to actually have the wider boundaries, which means it's a more wider response style. Basically, it's a more conservative, a more cautious response style that they are having. So they don't respond impulsively to these trials. And we want to see finally how these differences that we have seen until now, their individual differences in variability of reaction times, and how these differences in reaction time, maybe identifying differences in attention processes, and how we want to see how this is related to long-term outcomes. If you remember, we were going to be focusing on this course on the SDQ, so we conducted multiple regression analysis trying to identify which factors may be predicting the SDQ total score 6 months after the training was finished. And for that, we included different measures that we considered would be contributing, like IQ at baseline, SDQ at baseline, omission errors in the go, no-go task at baseline as an index of attention factor, attention processes in the very beginning, different academic performance, and still the same performance measures that have shown differences between the two groups. And we see that it's only the level of SDQ at baseline and the variability of the responses in the Mvac that is actually predictive of the ISDQ scores 6 months after the training. The same happens when we look at the reading scores 1 year after the training. None of these factors is significantly predicting reading scores, but only how stable the responses are during the Mvac performance are related to reading scores. So we could predict how well they would be 1 year later only by doing this. Then another aspect that we looked into was mathematics, the arithmetic scores. And in this case, we don't find any significant predictor, but we do see that again, the stability of the responses in the Mvac are actually close to significant there, although they don't reach the level, but they do reach the level of significance required in the mathematics and geometry scores, again, 12 months after the training. So this is all interesting, but because our sample is very small, we don't really know whether this would be an artifact and whether really measures of intra-individual variability on reaction time may be sensitive enough to well-being of the participant and real-life measures. And for that, we wanted to see in a larger sample and we turned to the ABCD sample, which at the moment had something over about 7,800 participants. It's a large study being conducted in the States, and they're recruiting samples from 21 sites. And they have a huge amount of data, including fMRI data with a similar Mvac task. So we were able to compute similar performance measures to the ones that we have used in our study and see how well these were associated with well-being measures. They don't have the SEQ, but they have a similar scale, which is the child behavioral checklist. And we have found the same association there, even if you control for a number of factors that may be influencing the CBCL total score, it is still stability in the responses and accuracy during the Mvac is predictive of CBCL total scores. And they don't have real measures of academic performance, but we took BMI instead, given the severity of the obesity epidemic. It is really relevant, the real life measures. And we see that again, stability in the responses in the Mvac is related to body mass index. So with this, I would like to conclude suggesting that our results suggest that yes, there are transfer effects in working memory. It does improve performance across different cognitive aspects, that there is a long-term impact, and we can see that the behavioral performance in the flanker and the Mvac task were actually related to long-term follow-up measures. And this is important because we have seen in the German study, and I can tell you that in the Swiss part of the study, also the preliminary results are suggesting the same, that evidence changes in school performance or classroom behavior are only seen at least after 6 months after the training has finished. And therefore, our cognitive task may be more sensitive to these underlying and initial subtle changes. And most importantly to me is that we have identified a potential mechanism of action of this working memory training. And that is by improving more basic cognitive functions like selective attention or sustained attention and inhibitory processes that may be starting to be better already straight after the training. They get better in time, and it's only in the long term that they can revert into evident outcomes in more higher cognitive working processes like working memory or in school performance measures. But I would be very happy to hear your feedback and your input about this data. And I would like to finish with the acknowledgement to my co-authors, to the funding bodies, and most importantly, to the families taking part in this study. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anna, for the interesting talk. Are there some questions? If there are no questions now, I think, Tobias, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nurit. So hi, everybody. Great for being here. I'd like to talk about basic numerical skills, unique or shared risk factor for comorbidity between ADHD and mathematics difficulties. First of all, a bit of background. I'll keep it brief. Deficits in calculation, basic numerical skills, and arithmetic fact retrieval are a key characteristic, of course, of children with mathematics difficulties at dyscalculia. There are numerous studies underlining this and showing
Tobias,
this.
I think your screen is in chat.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, we can't see your slides.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, now we can.
No, it works. Yes.
Sorry about that. I thought I shared it. I clicked on sharing, but somehow it didn't work. Okay, the first point I mentioned already. The second, ADHD is characterized by a persistent and age-inappropriate pattern of inattention and or hyperactive or impulsive behavior, as we all know, associated with deficits in executive functions and also with poor academic achievement, among others, math, of course. And the point is, what is the relationship between numerical processing and ADHD for this talk? So what do we know from the literature? Boys with ADHD were slower and less accurate on tasks of number recognition and transcoding than controls, according to Zental et al. And children with ADHD displayed severe impairments in tasks of counting, transcoding, and fact retrieval, according to work by Colomer et al., as well as number or magnitude comparison, according to Kaufman and Merck. And a study from my group showed that children with ADHD symptoms exhibited selective deficits in dot enumeration, but in no other basic numerical skills. 6 different basic numerical skills were assessed, and only in dot enumeration we actually found effects of ADHD, that is, decline in performance. However, children with ADHD performed better than children with MD, math difficulties, on tasks of counting, magnitude comparison, and number, facts retrieval, according to a study by Gonzalez, Castro et al. But in this study, there was no control group, so we only can compare these two groups, that is ADHD and a group of children with MD. And there is a study by Gaynor Stern and Steinhorn from 2018 showing that adults with ADHD are impaired in calculation processes that heavily rely on working memory capacity, but are not impaired in estimation skills that are based on a sense of magnitude. That is, apparently, based on this study, there is more of an effect on tasks that imply working memory capacity than in tasks that are processed in a more automatic fashion. Okay, so what was the goal of the present study? The key question here was, are basic numerical skills uniquely associated with MD, or are they also impaired in children with ADHD? In this study, we used a double dissociation design with 4 groups of children, as you'll see shortly. That is, we had a group of children with ADHD, a group of children with MD, a group of children with comorbid ADHD and MD, and an unimpaired control group. Like this, here you see it, double dissociation design. The advantage of this design is that one can tease apart a bit better the effects of ADHD and MD that they separately have on performance, for example, in basic numerical tasks. And additionally, you can, using a double dissociation design, look at the potential interaction between, for example, ADHD and MD. How do these two disorders simultaneously affect performance? Okay, what was the sample in our study? We had 86 children, 43 of them girls, aged 6 to 10 years. The general inclusion criteria for our study were IQ in the normal range, above 70. Children came from grade levels 2 to 4, with 11 children from grade 2, 36 from grade 3, and 39 from grade 4. Children spoke German as first language, or the language of instruction since the first grade was German. And children did not have any other mental disorders other than ADHD or ODD, positional defiant disorder, which is extremely comorbid with ADHD. We had 2 testing sites, Cologne and Münster. In Cologne, the Clinic of Children and Youth Psychiatry took the testing and also recruited all children with ADHD. And the Münster group took care of the children in the control group and the MD group. So what were group inclusion criteria? In order to be in the ADHD group, which comprised 33 individuals in our study, children had to have at least average arithmetic skills, that is a T-score above or equal to 40, and they had to have either a clinical diagnosis of ADHD, which was the case for 28 children here, or scale scores in the clinical range of an ADHD parent questionnaire, which was the case for 5 of the 33 children in the pure or isolated ADHD group. The MD group comprised 16 individuals, and below average arithmetic skills were required to be in this group, and of course, no symptoms of ADHD, according to ADHD parent questionnaire, and of course, no ADHD diagnosis. Inclusion criteria for the group ADHD and mathematical difficulties, 19 persons were in this group, were below average arithmetic skills, that is T-scores below 40, as we'll see shortly, and of course a clinical diagnosis of ADHD or scale scores in the clinical range of an ADHD parent questionnaire. 10 of these 19 children had a clinical diagnosis of ADHD and 9 had a scale score that was in the clinical range, and the control group, 18 children overall, had at least average arithmetic skills and no symptoms of ADHD. What were our diagnostic instruments? For assessing intelligence, we used the culture fair test, German version of it, CFT1R for younger children and CFT20R for older children. It's a language-free figural intelligence test. For assessing ADHD, either a clinical interview was conducted, the DCL-ADHS, which is based on ICD-10 criteria, and a parent questionnaire was filled out for all children participating in this study. Arithmetic calculation, mathematical skills were assessed with the arithmetic subscale from a curriculum-based assessment in German, DMAT, which is either focused on children in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade. And reading fluency as a control variable was assessed with the Salzburg-Lese screening 2nd to 9th grade. Okay, which basic numerical skills did we assess here and compare across groups? First of all, dot enumeration, which is based on the work by Brian Butterworth and Regosa Crespo. That is, children saw on screen this big white circle here filled white and black dots. And their task here was to count as quickly as possible the black dots. Overall, 18 items were presented. You see here the interface for answering 1 to 9 dots. And what we scored was the median of the correct response times. Then next task was number comparison, where children compared two single-digit numbers, which is the larger one. 24 items overall with systematically controlled distances between numbers. And we also took the median of the correct answers here as the score. Mixed comparison, children saw two different magnitudes, one symbolic and one non-symbolic, and were supposed to say which of these two magnitudes is the larger one, and the same scoring as in the other two tasks here was applied. Then we had a transcoding task. Children heard a number, spoken number, and should type them into this interface here. This was a task that was class specific, that is, 2nd graders heard different numbers than 3rd and 4th graders. These tasks here were identical. Then we had a number sets task based on the work by David Geary. There was a target number shown above and a kind of domino piece with a magnitude on it below, or two magnitudes, one in green, one in red here. Some of these domino pieces also had numbers, for example, non-symbolic magnitude on the left and a number like 1, 2, or 3 on the right. And the task here, this was a speed test. The task was of the children to decide, is the magnitude on this domino piece here the same or different from the target number shown above. The target numbers we used was 4 for 90 seconds maximum and 9 for 90 seconds at the maximum. And we scored this test by counting the hits and subtracting the false alarms. And then we had a number line estimation task, which you see here, number line from 0 to 100. Children saw a number and were supposed to click at the right position here on the number line that corresponds to the number shown above. Additionally, we did a task of fact retrieval, or two tests of fact retrieval, single-digit addition and single-digit subtraction. In the first one, the first task, single-digit addition, children were supposed to calculate or solve as many single-digit additions as possible within 2 minutes. And in the second test, the children were supposed to solve as many single-digit subtraction as possible within 2 minutes. All of the tests, that is the arithmetic fact retrieval tests and the basic numerical skill tasks here, had norm scores. That is, we were able to obtain norm or standardized scores for each of these tests. Okay, we come to the results. Demographics, we see here that in arithmetic, we see the MD and comorbid group were scoring very low as expected, and in the ADHD parent questionnaire, of course, both ADHD groups had high values and didn't differ from each other compared to the other two groups, control group and isolated math difficulties group. Importantly, there were no differences in intelligence, reading, or age across groups. Okay, now we did a 2x2 ANOVA to investigate whether there were main effects of MD, ADHD, or whether there was an interaction effect concerning the basic numerical tasks. And concerning dot enumeration, we did not find any effects at all. Also, concerning the number comparison task, there were no main effects and no interaction effects. The same was true for the mixed comparison task, but in the transcoding task, we found the main effect of math difficulties. That is the MD group, you see them on the right in these bar charts here. The MD group, the two MD groups scored lower than the no MD groups. There was also, interestingly, an ADHD effect here in this task, where the two groups with ADHD scored higher than the MD groups, but this effect was not stable when correcting here with Bonferroni-Holm. Okay, number sets, we found a stable effect of math difficulties, that is the MD groups scored lower, and there also was an ADHD effect. Both the ADHD effect was that ADHD impaired performance on number sets, but this effect also disappeared when correcting according to Bonferroni-Holm. No effect was found for number line estimation. And for both fact retrieval tasks, we found an MD effect. That is, the MD groups scored lower than the other groups. Okay, in the next step, we did a Bayesian ANOVA and compared different models against each other to find whether we have evidence in the data for null effects, or whether insignificant p-values actually are inconclusive with respect to comparison of groups. And what we found, you see the measures that we applied here on the left, dot enumeration and so on until facts. What we found is that we had three models where the main effect model MD was the best fitting model. That is, in transcoding, in number sets, and in subtraction facts, a model with only an MD main effect was the best fitting model. But we did not find any main effect of ADHD within the Bayesian analysis here at all. You see here the base factors, that is, huge base factors, those that are held in bold here, show evidence for the model, for example, the MD model compared to the null model in this case. You see the model comparisons in the upper line here. And very small base factors in italics here show evidence or provide evidence for the null model in this case. In conclusion, because time is running, what we see is that we found three MD main effect models here, that is differences between the MD groups, so to speak, and otherwise we only found null models, and nowhere did we find ADHD effects on our tasks here. Okay, so in line with prior research, we found substantial deficits in several basic numerical tasks, transcoding, number set, subtraction. These results were stable across frequentist and Bayesian analysis. We found no MD effects here in core markers of numeracy, which could be attributed possibly to the diagnostic instrument we used to assess mathematical abilities, which was focusing on arithmetic. ADHD does not seem to be systematically associated with substantial deficits in core markers of numeracy or subtraction fact retrieval here, but evidence of ADHD is less conclusive with respect to other basic numerical tasks and addition fact retrieval because the base factors were in an inconclusive range, and we found no evidence for interaction effects of MD and ADHD here at all. So generally, results are more in line with the assumption that basic numerical processing deficits are more strongly related to MD. And since ADHD symptoms per se were not convincingly associated with impaired basic numerical skills, difficulties in numerical tasks seem to remain indicative of MD, even in children with clinically significant ADHD symptoms. Okay. Limitations. We had power limitations here. Of course, the sample was not very, very large, but we could find at least medium effects could have found them. We had heterogeneous ADHD groups, clinical diagnosis and parent questionnaires were used here. And we also had no formal dyscalculia diagnosis here. We only used one single test here. Okay, that's it from me. So thanks for your attention. And I'm looking forward to questions if there are any.
Many thanks, Tobias, for the interesting talk. And now there are some questions to Tobias or the other talks.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. You're welcome.
All right. Okay. So thank you very much for the nice talk. It was very interesting. And I was wondering on the IQ measures. So when you show the IQ, I noticed that the MD group has a score of 92, about 92, while the other had a score of 99. So it's almost 7-8 points standard deviations, which might be one of the causes of this larger impairment in mathematics. I wonder if you can speculate on that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good observation. You're right. It was really the single group here with lower IQ. As I said initially, overall, the effect was not statistically significant comparing the four groups, but we often find this. We often have this. That is, if we look at children with MD, we often find that their IQ is on average slightly lower than comparable groups. And so this finding from that perspective is not really surprising, one could say. But concerning the matching of the groups, one could say, well, possibly there are some small IQ effects in the sense that the lower IQ in the math group, even though it's not significant, may have affected results in a way that we cannot say right now. We had another study in Journal of Learning Disabilities where we matched groups perfectly for IQ, MD and no MD and other groups. And well, the results did not differ that much. So I'm not sure. You're right. It could play a role, but it's of course difficult to answer this with this data that we have here. So I must remain inconclusive in a sense. But yeah, it would have been better if the IQ mean IQs across groups would have been the same. But well, that's not what you often find.
I have a question. A follow-up question to David. Did you ever include the IQ as a covariate in your ANOVAs? And if so, did the results change?
That's a good question. We didn't, not yet, but we could do that easily, of course, to check whether. Yeah.
Because I think it would not be much of a problem if the main results stay and you use it as a covariate. However, if some of the MD results disappear after you use it as a covariate, it would be a problem. Yeah. And the second question, when I looked at your tasks, some tasks were age dependent and some were like the DMAT, and also for transcoding you said you use different stimuli. And for other tasks, you didn't use age dependent stimuli. For instance, I think number line task and also some of the dot tasks. And since you tested grade 2 to 4, I was a little bit concerned if you have ceiling effects in some of the tasks, which might mask. I mean, in our study of 2008, we also had ceiling effects in some of the tasks, which might mask eventual differences, which may appear if you would run more complex versions of the task. You only showed us the t-values, but in terms of accuracy and reaction times, were there ceiling effects in some of the simple tasks, especially in the older children?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, we have a paper under revision and the reviewers ask the same question, and therefore I know the answer. There were no big ceiling effects concerning the t-values, at least. That is, we had age-appropriate norm samples, of course, second, third, and fourth graders, with whom we could compare the individual performance. And the results that I showed actually were based on these standard scores. So the variance between the children, even fourth graders on a number line from 0 to 100, it was still there. Mm-hmm. But concerning the raw scores, you're right, of course, that the variance, if we look at the absolute discrepancy between the target, the average discrepancy between target answer and response, of course, this becomes smaller the older the children become. That's true.
Because you can always, of course, transform it into t-values and you get some values. But if you have very little explained variance, then the resulting variance that you still have comes from whatever random errors, more likely, and lapses in concentration. If you have a task where 1 or 2 errors already make a t-value under 50 or so. So that would. I wasn't a reviewer, but I would be concerned as well. Basically, I would like, so basically my question would be, what would be the raw data? How many mistakes can you really make? What is the variance in mistakes? And if it's just 1 or 2 mistakes, then I wouldn't be so confident about the null effects.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know this right now, but what I can tell you is that we looked at the validities of the raw scores, that is the average errors in second, third, and fourth grade, and correlated them with calculation. What we found is that in the second grade, the correlation between number line performance and calculation was 0.5, and it shrank to 0.3 in fourth grade for the number line task that we used here. So there is still some variation, but it shrinks. But I should look it up. Yeah.
And you had only until 100 in the number line task, or did you go up to 1,000 or larger numbers?
No, unfortunately not. It was only 0 to 100.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, is there any other question to Tobias? I found one from Benjamin to Anna in the chat. Is Benjamin still here? Benjamin Conrad?
I am. Yep.
Okay, go ahead. You can ask now.
Yeah, so I was just wondering about the drift analysis, if you could get these parameters per individual, and like perhaps if you related it back to the brain data, maybe it would tell you kind of what the striatum is doing, if it's modulating one of those parameters in particular. Just if you could speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah, we did that. We do estimate the drift parameters per individuals, yes, and we do recover these parameters. We do simulate parameters per individual, and we try to recover the differences between the two groups, and they do well this, so that works perfectly fine. We did try to relate this to the metrics back to the brain data, yes, in the flanker task, and it didn't give us any significant differences. So there were some associations with the dorsal anterior cingulate, so it seems that this may be driving somehow, that they may be driving the attention to the target fish and enhancing somehow this cognitive control during this task, but they were not surviving multiple corrections. So that's why we cannot show any brain imaging data, because it didn't survive any threshold. So yeah, okay. It is interesting. With a larger sample, maybe we could find more consistent results, but yeah, when they don't survive, we cannot do much there.
Gotcha, thank you.
Any more questions? So I think we are running over time, and when there are no questions, I like to close the symposium. And thank you all for the interest, and of course Anna and Tobias for the interesting. To close now. Okay. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.